A frontier woman's hidden cellar becomes the last warmth her children have when a brutal freeze traps their homestead, proving every settler who mocked her dead wrong. The night the cold came wasn't slow, wasn't gentle, and certainly wasn't the kind of winter folks told stories about later with a touch of nostalgia. It struck like a punishment, sweeping down from the high ridge before anyone in the scatter of cabins along the valley floor had time to brace for it. Wind slammed against plank walls so hard it rattled plates, and in the lee of the cottonwoods the brittle branches snapped clean off under sheets of ice, forming faster than a man could speak a prayer. But in the middle of that chaos, while every settler was fighting the cold with frantic hands and breaking fires, a frontier woman named Mara Hale was dragging her two shivering children across the yard toward the cellar everyone had mocked her for building. And the most gut-twisting part was that she wasn't dragging them out of some sense of eccentric pride or stubbornness. She was dragging them there because the main cabin was already too cold to breathe in. The children, Elias 8 and Ruth barely 6, kept stumbling on the drift forming against the root cellar door, the snow swirling thick and sharp as thrown sand. But Mara refused to loosen her grip. The cold was sinking too fast, too deep. She could feel it climbing her spine, numbing the places she had once sworn would never go numb again, not after last winter's nights when she had held her husband's hand as he coughed blood and whispered apologies for letting the cabin grow cold. She had buried him before spring had thawed, and she had sworn with a rage that felt like a second heartbeat, that her children would never again depend on a single fire, a single wall, a single anything to keep them alive. So she built the cellar, and the settlers laughed. They laughed because it wasn't even a proper root cellar, not the kind old families built with thick beams and stone cuts hauled from quarries. Mara had dug it with her own hands, carving it into the slope like some half-lost badger, reinforcing it with scavenged boards, clay packed tight along the interior, and a venting shaft she had argued over with herself 100 times before settling on a shape that wouldn't let in wind but would still breathe. They laughed because she built it too deep. They laughed because she insisted the earth would keep warmth longer than wood. They laughed because the last storm hadn't been that bad. They laughed because she was a woman working alone while managing two small children, and some men needed to laugh at what they could never do. But Mara never forgot the cold that took her husband, nor the way her children had cried quietly under blankets so thin she could see their rib outlines in the firelight. She had built the cellar because she had to. Now, with the screams of freezing wind tearing overhead and the cabin walls frost-white and stiff, she thanked whatever stubbornness lived in her bones that she'd dug it. Ruth was crying, her mittened hands held against her face not to wipe tears but to shield her cheeks from the biting ice. Elias tried to help her, but he was shaking too hard to do anything except lean into his mother as she pulled them both down the short slope toward the cellar door. The wind hammered at them, and for a moment Mara feared the latch had frozen. She had to slam her shoulder against the wood twice before it gave way with a tearing groan. The warmth wasn't immediate. She knew the cellar wasn't magic, but the air below felt different, thicker, safer, and that difference meant everything. The children stumbled inside, and Mara pulled the door shut behind them, with a heaviness that felt like sealing themselves away from a world turning unkind. She could hear the settlers' voices in her memory. What kind of mother drags kids underground? What kind of woman thinks dirt is warmer than wood? But the moment she dropped the lantern flame to life, its glow catching the clay-packed walls, the space looked exactly as she had always imagined. Humble, safe, steady. A place built not for pride, not for defiance, but for survival. The wind outside howled so fiercely that the door hinges trembled. Mara felt it vibrate through her shoulder blades, but her children were already crawling toward the back of the cellar, where she had lined a platform with quilts, wool, and the padded coat her husband once wore. Elias climbed onto it first, his teeth chattering, while Ruth burrowed in after him, her breath making little puffs of fog in the lamplight. "Ma," Elias whispered, his voice small, "is it gonna get colder?" "Yes," she said, because lies were a luxury she couldn't afford. "But not in here, not like outside." The truth was harsh. Colder weather was still coming. Rumors had spread for days about a hard freeze, the kind that animals sensed before people did, the kind that made livestock bolt and birds go silent. The valley had known winters, brutal ones, but nothing like this sweeping front that seemed to swallow the horizon. Folks had prepared as best they could, but many relied on their cabins, their fireplaces, their routines. Mara knew better. Wood failed, fires died, clay held heat, earth cradled warmth. The soil was a keeper, stubborn and steady. She hung the lantern from its hook and pressed her hands against the packed wall. It felt cool, not warm, but steady. That steadiness was a promise. The cellar wasn't large, just long enough for a family of 3 to sit without brushing elbows, just tall enough for Mara to straighten her back, but it held the heat of their bodies, and that was what she needed. She fed a small ember stove she had built from scavenged iron plates, its vent running through the wall in a curve so the cold couldn't force a backdraft. The settlers had laughed at that too. Why build a stove in dirt? Why risk smoke underground? But they didn't understand how carefully she had studied every detail, how many nights she had lain awake imagining airflow patterns, thickness of clay, the slope of the chimney. She had built it all the way she wished someone had built something for her when she needed it most. The stove hissed faintly as the ember caught, warming the tiny space by degrees so slow they were nearly invisible. But after 10 minutes, Ruth's fingers had uncurled. After 20, Elias's shaking had stopped. After 30, the children were leaning against each other, breathing easier, their eyelids drooping. But Mara didn't rest. She couldn't. Outside, the storm raged in a way she hadn't imagined even in her worst fears. The wind carried a pitch, high, strained, desperate, like hundreds of branches snapping all at once. She could feel the cold gnawing at the soil above them, freezing it inch by inch. If anything shifted, if the weight changed, if the vent clogged, if the door froze shut, no. She couldn't think like that. She had built it well. She had built it strong. The settlers had mocked her, yes, but they hadn't seen her hands bleed while packing the clay, hadn't seen her hauling logs twice her weight to reinforce the entryway, hadn't seen her reading scraps of old almanacs by lantern light searching for hints on ground temperature retention and winterproofing. They had only seen the surface, the strange woman digging in dirt while her kids played nearby, the woman who spoke little and grieved too openly. No one had seen the purpose, not until now. A sudden knock thudded against the cellar door. Mara froze. Another knock, harder. The children stirred, sleepy but startled. A voice shouted through the wind, muffled, urgent. "Mara! Mara Hale! You down there?" Her stomach clenched. She knew that voice. Thomas Reddick, one of the men who had laughed the loudest at her digging, a man who had once told her she'd do better finding another husband than digging holes like a wild animal. Why was he here? Why now? She moved toward the door but didn't open it. She pressed her ear against the cold wood. "Mara!" he shouted again, his voice cracking. "Please, please open up. The cold, it's killing us. We lost the fire. My boy. Mara, please." Her breath caught. His boy, his son, who had been so full of life last fall. She had seen him running through prairie grass with both hands spread like wings. "What happened?" she called through the door. A pause, a terrible, breaking pause. "He's freezing. I can't keep him warm. No one can. The cabin walls." "Mara, please, I'm begging you. Let us in." The children sat up behind her, their faces pale. The cellar was small, too small for more bodies, too small for more breath, too small for more heat to be shared without losing the fragile balance she had created. But outside there was a dying boy and a father desperate, enough to swallow every pride-filled laugh he had ever thrown her way. Mara felt the weight of the moment, heavier than any storm. What she chose would change everything. Maybe their survival, maybe her children's future, maybe the valley's understanding of what she had built. Her hand hovered over the latch. The wind shrieked above them, and before she could decide, another voice joined Thomas's, a woman's voice shaking. "Mara, please, we're losing them." More settlers? How many were outside? How many cabins had failed? How many fires had died? Mara's pulse beat against her ribs like a hammer. She hadn't built the cellar for them, but the world didn't care about intentions in moments like this. Her children watched her, silent, trusting, and Mara understood, with a clarity sharp as the frozen air above. This night wasn't just about surviving the cold, it was about surviving who she became next. She unlatched the door, and the storm rushed in like a wounded animal. The moment Mara cracked open the cellar door, the cold hit her like a slap. No, not even that gentle. It was a wall of pain, a smothering force that reached past her coat and her resolve and scraped against her ribs with claws of ice. Snow curled in immediately, a ribbon of frozen breath that snaked along the packed earth floor and made her children flinch. Elias buried Ruth's face against his chest like he was older than he was, like he'd already figured out the wind could steal her breath if it wanted. Outside the door stood 3 figures. Thomas Reddick, clutching his boy to his chest like a sack of flour, snow crusted in the boy's hair, and ice frozen along his brows. Behind him, Alma Treadwell, the widow from Up Creek, tears frozen on her cheeks, and beside her, the Hofer girl, only 15, and holding her younger sister's limp hand in both of hers. Mara didn't ask how they'd made it. She didn't want to know which horses had dropped or what doors had splintered from the frost. The answer was written on their faces. They were only alive because they hadn't stopped moving, and now they were here, at her door. She stepped aside without speaking. The cellar groaned under the weight of more footsteps. The air inside shifted, already warming, already intimate, suddenly crowded. Thomas ducked in with his boy, whose lips were blue and twitching. Alma followed, dragging herself more than walking, her breath hitching in half-sobs. The Hofer girl came last, her mouth tight with something too fierce to be fear. Then Mara closed the door again. The noise of the storm vanished, swallowed by packed earth and clay. What remained was silence, and the soft wheeze of Thomas's son trying to breathe. The boy, named Caleb, Mara remembered, couldn't seem to keep his limbs from jerking. His fingers were turning an unnatural color, not just red with cold, but glassy, the kind of color you didn't come back from. "Here," Mara said, moving quickly to the quilted platform, her hands already reaching to strip layers from herself. "Put him here." Thomas obeyed without question, which told Mara everything about how far the cold had gone to break him. She layered blankets over Caleb. Ruth and Elias pressed themselves to the wall, wide-eyed. The cellar now held 8 people, each radiating a different kind of panic. Thomas clenching and unclenching his jaw, Alma wringing her hands like they could squeeze warmth out of the air, the Hofer girl scanning every corner like it might give her an escape route. No one mocked the dirt walls now. They sat huddled, all breath and tremble, as the stove worked its slow, ember-fed miracle. It wasn't meant to heat this many. It would take longer now, but it would hold if they held together. Mara added wood, not much. She had counted each scrap weeks ago and knew exactly how long it would last. Every piece she burned now shortened what they'd have tomorrow. But tomorrow didn't matter if the boy died tonight. Alma finally spoke. We tried to stay. We did. But the wind, it split the beams. My kitchen wall caved. I woke up to snow on my pillow." Mara nodded once, then looked at Thomas. He met her eyes for only a second before he had to glance away. He looked like he wanted to say something pride had long buried. But all that came out was a whisper. "I should have built one like this." No one responded. The confession hung in the warming air, soft and bitter. Mara didn't need to say she had told them. She didn't want to. It didn't help anything now. The earth under them had no need for smugness. It was too busy holding them all alive. Ruth slipped off the quilts and wandered toward Mara, her small hand finding her mother's without asking. "Are we safe now?" she asked. Mara knelt, brushed Ruth's hair back and said, "We're warmer now. That's what matters." But her heart was saying other things. The door latch hadn't sealed cleanly. The vent was probably too wet for proper draw, and they were already using more air than the space had been meant for. Still, no one had frozen to death yet, and in the morning, if the storm let up, they might climb out to see what remained. But the storm had other ideas. That night the wind turned. The pitch changed. Not weaker, not fading, but more shrill, more surgical. It cut, probing through gaps, slithering into corners like it had learned something from the ones who had built cabins too close to the surface. Mara didn't sleep. She sat against the far wall with Elias curled against her side and Ruth on her lap, both finally dozing, their skin warmer now, less blue. But she watched the door. Every creak of the wood made her heart climb a little higher in her throat. Every gust outside made her look up to the vent shaft, watching for smoke reversal or signs the draft had failed. Caleb stirred in his father's arms, not from recovery, from fever. His face was slick. The cold had turned inward now, burning from the center out. "We need more heat," Thomas whispered. Mara glanced at her pile. 5 logs, no more split kindling, 1 last strip of oilcloth. "Not yet," she said. "He's burning up." "No," she said firmer. "He's freezing from the inside. His body's confused. If we spike the heat now, it might stop his heart." Thomas's eyes filled with something close to fury, but it broke quickly, broke into grief, then into shame. He nodded and pulled the boy closer. Mara kept her eyes on the vent. The Hofer girl hadn't spoken at all since they arrived. Now she moved, slow and stiff, toward the shelves in the back. The shelves Mara had lined with her winter stores. Dried beans, smoked rabbit, thick biscuits wrapped in linen, jars of rendered tallow. Mara stood. "Don't!" The girl froze. "I wasn't," she started, but her voice cracked. "It's not for me. My sister. She hasn't eaten in days." Mara glanced at the younger Hofer girl. She hadn't spoken, hadn't blinked in a while. Her lips were dry. "Ration it," Mara said. 1 biscuit, half a jar of water." The girl nodded quickly, her hands shaking more from hunger than fear. In that moment, Mara saw it again, that terrible shape forming in the cellar's breath. This was no longer about just surviving the cold. This was about surviving each other. Food, air, warmth, all now shared among people who hadn't prepared, who hadn't listened, who had laughed. She felt anger rise, uninvited, but Ruth's head on her chest quieted it. Elias stirred. "Ma," he whispered, "will there be enough?" He didn't mean food. He didn't mean logs. He meant hope. She lied for the first time that night. Yes, because children didn't need the truth right now, not the one Mara felt rising with every gust above. The storm had buried them. and they hadn't yet seen the worst of it. By the third day, the world above was a grave. No one said it outright, but each of them had come to understand it in their own quiet way. The air down in the cellar had thickened into something that barely moved, their voices growing softer and more infrequent, as if the dirt walls were absorbing not just sound, but willpower. Outside, the wind no longer howled, it whined, a ceaseless, high-pitched note that didn't fade, didn't shift. It just stayed, like something alive, wounded and watching. Mara knew this kind of cold didn't just kill bodies. It did something worse. It made people lose the fight before they were frozen stiff. It scraped the instinct to survive out of their bones and left behind a numbness that made death seem like rest. That was the danger now. Not the hunger, not the cold, but the giving in. It began with Caleb. He stopped shivering. That was the first sign. His hands had curled inward, and when Thomas touched his cheeks and whispered his name, the boy didn't even flinch. His chest still rose and fell, but too shallow, like someone sleeping under ice. Mara leaned over him slowly. "He's going," Thomas said in a hollow tone. "No," she replied. "He's conserving." But they both knew the lie. Mara reached into the cloth bundle tucked behind her stove, her last set of fireberries, dried wild root, and crushed bark shavings. It wasn't medicine, not really, but it was what she'd used last winter, when her husband had started coughing blood. It hadn't saved him, but it had bought them a few more days to say goodbye. She boiled the mix in a tin cup, and the scent was strong, bitter, sharp, smoky. Alma turned her head and wept quietly, the sound more like breathing than crying now. Mara lifted the cup to Caleb's mouth and dripped what she could between his cracked lips, and then she sat back and waited, not for a miracle. She had stopped believing in those when the spring thaw revealed her husband's grave mound, half melted and alone in the clearing. No, she waited for something worse. Either the moment his breath would stop, or the moment Thomas would look at her like it was her fault for not doing more. Neither came. Instead, it was the Hofer girl who broke the silence. "Someone's walking out there." Mara turned sharply. "What did you say?" The girl pointed to the door. "I heard it. Steps, like heavy ones." Mara crossed the space in 3 strides and pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Then, crunch, a slow, deliberate footstep. Then another. Too even to be storm debris, too loud to be any animal. Mara felt every hair on her arms lift. She motioned everyone to stay silent. The cellar went still. Another step. Then, closer, a voice. "Mara Hale?" It wasn't a man she recognized. The voice had the accent of someone from the low towns, maybe passed through on mule caravan, someone who didn't belong to this valley. The man spoke again, louder this time. "Mara Hale, I'm told you have shelter." No one moved. "I got 3 more with me, 2 women and a boy. One of them can't walk anymore." Still no one moved. Then the man said something that twisted Mara's gut into a knot. "I was told you'd help, said you were the only one who prepared." She stood frozen. Who had told him that? And how far had they come through the storm to reach her? "Please," he said, "we're out of time." Thomas looked at her with hollow eyes. "We can't take more." Ruth started crying, a soft sound that Elias tried to smother. Mara walked back toward the door. "You bring that storm with you?" she called out, voice sharper than she expected. "No, ma'am," the man answered, "but it chased us halfway down the ridge." She opened the latch, only a crack. The man looked worse than she feared, his beard caked in frost, eyelids rimmed in ice. A woman behind him slumped over the back of a half-dead mule, her face the color of wax. Another woman clutched a boy, barely older than Ruth. There was no choice. Mara opened the door fully and motioned them in. As they stumbled inside, the weight of what she had done hit her. The air was already tight, the heat low, the food gone thin, and now they were 11. 11 souls in a hole meant for 3. The woman on the mule collapsed into Alma's arms. The man crouched near the stove and began rubbing his hands, clearly knowing how dangerous it was to warm up too fast. The boy didn't cry. He just stared at Ruth with empty eyes. Mara turned and shut the door, but the wind didn't howl anymore. It laughed. Somewhere above, the drifts were building deeper, the snow packing harder. The storm hadn't let up. It had settled in. Elias tugged at her sleeve that night while everyone was dozing in turns. "Ma?" She looked down. "Why are they all coming here?" She hesitated. "Because I dug when they built." "Why didn't they dig too?" "Because they thought I was a fool. Because they trusted the sky to be gentle. Because they didn't believe it could ever get this bad." "I don't know," she said softly, and Elias, bless him, accepted that. But Mara didn't, because she did know. They had trusted things to stay the same, and she had prepared for the worst. But now she hadn't prepared enough. The stove was choking. The vent wasn't breathing right. She lit a stub of candle and climbed the short tunnel to the shaft, poking with a stick to clear the clog. Ice shattered and spilled inward. The draft returned, faint but present. She stayed there for several minutes, alone, staring at the single shaft of air that stood between life and suffocation. Then something strange happened. She smelled smoke, not her stove, not her kindling, wood smoke. From outside, someone was burning above, and not just that. The crackle sounded close, too close. She scrambled back down. "Get back!" she shouted. Everyone jolted awake. She yanked the stove cover open and doused the fire with dirt. Then she threw herself at the wall near the chimney shaft. Crackling, and now, light. A thin glow pulsed through the packed clay. Someone had built a fire directly over their vent. She didn't know if it was ignorance, accident, or something worse, but the smoke would kill them before the cold did, if it funneled downward. Mara grabbed a shovel. "What are you doing?" Alma asked. "Digging us out before we choke. But it's 40 below. And we'll be 40 corpses if we wait." She slammed the blade into the soil above the cellar's threshold. Once, twice, Thomas joined her. No hesitation. So did the Hofer girl. Together they clawed upward toward air. The shovel hit packed frost before it hit air. The upper soil had hardened into something more like granite than dirt, compressed by ice, layered with wind-driven crust, frozen so deep it refused to give up a single flake without a fight. But Mara didn't stop. She couldn't. She'd seen what smoke did to a body when it crept in slowly, whispering through lungs that had already been weakened by days of poor air and thinner breath. She couldn't let them die like that. Not like her husband, not like the settler child she once found half frozen in the bend of the creek 3 winters ago, stiff as dry wood with no sign of pain left on his face. Just surrender. Her hands blistered quickly, the old leather gloves doing little against the grind of steel and ice. Thomas hacked beside her with a chunk of wood shaped like a chisel. The Hofer girl, despite the blood trickling from one of her knuckles, clawed with her bare hands when her tool snapped in two. No one spoke. No one needed to. They were racing death. Not the cold anymore, not hunger, not even despair, but smoke, the most silent kind of killer. Below them, the cellar air had thickened again. The children had been moved near the wall furthest from the vent, where the seep of black breath was slowest. Elias sat with Ruth wrapped in both arms. Her head drooped against his chest, her eyelids fluttering. Caleb had grown eerily quiet again. Alma fanned near the stove with a strip of cloth, but it was a losing battle. The man from the ridge, the stranger, knelt near the tunnel slope, trying to keep the newer arrivals awake by tapping their cheeks, whispering their names. Delia, Nora, the boy they simply called Red. "Don't let them sleep," Mara gasped, not looking back. "We're trying," the stranger called. Above, her blade finally cracked something. Not soft, not ice, but heat. A wave of warmth brushed against her glove, followed by a puff of soot. She yanked back as a curl of smoke twisted into her face. She'd breached the fire pit. Whoever had built it, whether settler, traveler, or vagrant, had unknowingly built their camp directly atop her vent shaft. And the fire was still going. Mara didn't think. She shouted down, "Cover your mouths!" Then she pulled her shawl tight across her own face, lowered her head, and slammed the shovel through the topmost layer. The smoke burst inward like a wound, flooding the tunnel with a rush of black vapor, but it passed her in a moment and billowed downward into the cellar in a sudden, terrible surge. Coughing exploded below, choking, gagging, the shuffling of feet, the knocking over of jars and crates. Someone screamed, a short, sharp cry, and then silence. She dropped through the tunnel like a shot and skidded down into the chamber. The lantern was flickering, almost out. The air was choking. She grabbed the door latch and tore it open wide. It was suicide, but it was the only chance. The storm met her face like a slap from a giant. Ice crystals scoured her cheeks. Her eyes stung and watered instantly, but the wind sucked the smoke outward, pulling the thick blackness away from the chamber's heart, dragging it out into the blizzard like a breath finally exhaled. The risk paid off. The children gasped first. Sudden, wrenching sobs that sounded like "Drowning!" Caleb gagged. Ruth whimpered. Even the stranger dropped to his knees, coughing hard enough to spit blood. But they were breathing. Thomas stumbled over, helping slam the door again before too much heat fled. Mara collapsed to her knees. The fire above had saved someone, but nearly killed them all. That was the nature of survival now. No good deed or bad mistake came without collateral. They sat in stunned silence for a long while. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice was so quiet it took Mara a moment to understand her. "Is it morning?" Mara looked toward the sliver of vent light. It wasn't golden, but it was less black. The storm might not have passed, but it had thinned. "I think it is," she said. "Or close." Thomas sat cross-legged with his hands in his lap, staring at his son. "He's breathing stronger," he murmured. Elias, leaning against the back wall, whispered, "We can't stay down here." Mara didn't want to agree, but she knew he was right. There was only one reason strangers would be wandering near the homesteads and building fires at random, because every other shelter had failed, because cabins had splintered or roofs had collapsed, because the valley had fallen. And if that was true, if the storm had truly broken the ridge and spilled over like water from a cracked basin, then this little dirt cellar was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. They needed to move. But how? With what? Mara stood, her legs trembling, and began to plan the way she always had, silently, methodically, without hope. First, the strongest would go above. Thomas, the stranger, herself. They'd check the house. If it was gone, they'd look for the shed. If that was gone, they'd try the West Hill. There had been an old mail station there, abandoned 2 summers ago. If the roof had held, it could shelter 11. She dug out every usable scrap of cloth, ripped open bags for liner, took the 2 woolen shawls and stitched them together with a bone needle and twine. The cellar had done what it was built to do. It had bought them time. Now it was done. They emerged into daylight so blinding it made Mara stumble. The snow reflected back like the world had turned into glass. The house was still standing, but barely. One side of the roof had collapsed. The chimney had shattered. A mound of snow had plugged the front door entirely. The shed was a pile of white rubble, but the path west was visible, a corridor of broken trees and drifted fence lines. She turned toward Thomas. He nodded. Toward the stranger. He nodded too, his eyes narrowed against the wind. She looked behind her, back down into the cellar. Ruth stared up at her, still too weak to climb. "Ma," she said, "is it worse up there?" Mara paused. "No," she answered. "It's just bigger." They built a crude sled out of wood panels and rope, layered it with the last blankets, laid Caleb and Ruth on it first. Elias insisted on walking. The rest followed, heads low, bodies wrapped in layers too thin for what lay ahead. As they crested the low rise west of the cabin, Mara turned back one last time. The cellar mouth stood dark and quiet. She had dug it in desperation. They had survived in it by grace. And now they left it, not because it had failed, but because it had done everything it could. By the time the wind erased their tracks, the horizon had already begun to warm, just slightly, enough to make the crust of snow crackle instead of scream, enough to give her the first true thought she'd allowed herself in days. They might just live, not because anyone saved them, but because she had built something when no one believed she should, and because the earth, in all its silent judgment, had given them back a little warmth when the world had nothing else left.